Welcome to the ninth presentation of Self-Determination in the Post-Colonial World. This session is to do with the colonisation of Palestine. And as before, here is an overview of the sections I'm going to go through. I'm going to introduce Palestine, talk about the Israeli colony, talk about the question of apartheid in relation to occupied Palestine, talking about Palestinian resistance, and end up on some thoughts on the future of Palestine. In the late 1940s, towards the end of the colonial era, European Zionists, including Russian and American, established a colony in Palestine as part of their legacy or from their patron, the British, which had taken the province from the Ottoman Empire earlier in the 20th century. But this colonisation or recolonisation was resisted, and after 7 decades of ethnic cleansing, Palestinian resistance to the racialised Israeli colony has not diminished. So an analytical question I pose here is, what are the elements of an apartheid state? There have been several reports in recent years that are giving a wider recognition to the status of the Israeli colony as an apartheid state. So let's understand what an apartheid state is and why is the Israeli colony now considered to be an apartheid state. Now, many of the references in this presentation are taken from these set readings, and in particular my article from a few years ago, The Future of Palestine. Palestine has an ancient history with pluralist populations. It hasn't been ever totally homogeneous in terms of religious or community groups. Indigeneity, of course, is to do with ancestral status, not just religious status. It's to do with ongoing continuous connections and occupation with a land. And demographically, when the colony began, the Jewish settlers aimed at least 80% domination. Now they are a little bit less than 50%. So it's a colony which has a very uncertain future, let's say. Palestine itself has an ancient history with the city of Jericho, for example, on the edge of the Jordan River, founded perhaps 10,000 years ago, and with the capture of the holy city of Jerusalem by a variety of empires over the centuries. After the British and French captured the Levant and other Arab lands from the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century, they began a series of partitions to divide up the peoples of the region so that there wouldn't be a very strong, united opposition to their colonial control. And most of that division was to weaken any Arab state that would emerge, and another part was to allocate lands to the Zionist movement of the European Jews. In Palestinian heritage, there is evidence of ancient humans living and settling in that region from a very long time back, many hundreds of thousands of years. In ancient history, we've got long records of various empires and kingdoms which vied for control in that area prior to in the BC area, before Christ era. Yet the thousands of archaeological sites today in historic Palestine are often linked to the three great monotheistic faiths which consider as holy the city of Jerusalem, and that's why in Arabic the city is called Al-Quds, the holy. It has sections which are Christian, which are Muslim, and which are Jewish. In the 4th century, the Eastern Roman Empire brought churches to Palestine. In the Umayyad period, after the founding of Islam, Islamic architecture appeared, and during the European Crusades, religious pretexts were used for warfare and for the control of Jerusalem. After that, there were other empires, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, who left their mark. And so after World War I, as I mentioned, the French and British empires divided up the region for their own purposes. But those thousands of years of indigenous cultural heritage remain. And by the turn of the 20th century, indigenous Palestinians were about 80% Muslim. Jewish Palestinians, there's always been a Jewish and a Christian minority in Palestine. By 1882, the Jewish minority was about 8%. In 1931, there was about 17%, and it increased with emigration encouraged by the Zionist movement in Europe and Russia over that period up until the time of the creation of the colony in the late 1940s, when the Jewish population had risen to about 32%, or almost a third of the area. But despite the ambitions of Zionist immigration from Europe and from the USA, and particularly from Eastern Europe, for example, Jewish people today comprise only about 50%, or a little less, the population of historic Palestine. Well, the question of indigeneity arises. Who are indigenous people? The Zionist movement is not an indigenous movement. It claims some ethnic and religious connections to the region, but it's not indigenous. Indigenous people in international law are those who have a right to redress for the confiscation of their lands, or restitution for lands, territories and resources taken. But that typically refers to the return of Indigenous lands, territories and resources continuously until the present or very recently occupied, used or enjoyed by an Indigenous community that's been encroached upon by third parties. All 13 of Israel's prime ministers since 1948 have come from European families. Not one came from a family which had lived in Palestine more than one generation. Yet they all claim, under this peculiar Zionist philosophy, a right to return to a mythical ancestral land. In recent times, there's been an attempt to deny the fact that Palestine even existed. It wasn't always the case. The Zionists didn't always say that. But more recently, there is this very strong theme, propaganda line, if you like, that Palestine does not exist, and it's become a matter of debate in a number of Western countries. But of course, we have maps of Palestine going back not just under the British, but under the Ottomans and well before that. But you can see from the map at the top right there that the territory which was regarded as Palestine and the encroachment of Israel has meant that the idea of Palestinian land has shrunk consistently since the late 1940s to a point now where there are only tiny fragments within the West Bank and Gaza, which are now have a type of local council status under Israeli suzerainship. So as the land controlled by Palestine shrinks, today's Zionists can claim that Palestine never existed, but they didn't always say this. Here, for example, is a short video from former Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, and you see from one of her postcards in 1930 that her address, she'd come from Eastern Europe and grew up in the United States, then came to live in Palestine, and she says, she said that I am Palestinian. This was an early version of Zionist philosophy, that the Zionist Jews are in fact some sort of cousins or relatives of the Palestinians.
I mean, when were Palestinians born? What was all this area before the First World War? When Britain got the mandate over Palestine, what was Palestine then? Palestine was then the area between the Mediterranean and the Iraqi border.
You say there is no such thing as a Palestinian?
East and West Bank, no. East and West Bank was Palestine. I'm a Palestinian. From 21 until 48, I carried a Palestinian passport. There was no such thing in this area as Jews and Arabs and Palestinians. There were Jews and Arabs.
So the Israeli colony. Now, Zionism and the European Jews, this was a mostly secular colonial project which drew on religious myth and came after centuries of anti-Jewish discrimination in Europe. Of course, it was inspired by the big push, a second wave of colonialism in Europe in the 19th century. The religious myths for Zionism came from biblical texts, the idea of a promised land, and the cult of Second Temple revivalism, which suggested that the Jewish people would not have their social and spiritual vindication until their Second Temple, which was said to be destroyed in the Roman era about 70 AD, was reconstructed in Jerusalem. And eventually European Zionists managed to extract a promise, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, of land in the Levant from the British government as it took possession of the region from the Ottomans. The British objective was to establish a strategic corner in the Near East, a body of people in close coalition with the British, and the French, for their part, had created an artificial Christian majority in Lebanon with similar objectives, imagining that that little country would remain loyal to Europe and to France, even though that artificial majority in the Lebanon has now long gone. Europe indeed has a very long history of anti-Jewish campaigns and pogroms. And Zionism has to be seen in relation to that long history. The official European Christian churches, beginning with that of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD, played a very important role in embedding anti-Judaism. In Europe, this is called anti-Semitism, although Semites are the people who speak languages including northeastern African languages and Arabic, and Hebrew is one of those Semitic languages. But in the European terms, anti-Semitism is really meant to mean anti-Judaism. Jews were blamed for various things through the centuries in Europe, including the killing of Jesus of Nazareth. They were often barred from holding land and public office, and they were expelled from various European countries at different times. Purges of Jews occurred sporadically, because at times also they were an influential minority group in Europe. But at critical times of history and in many European countries, there was this repression of Jewish communities. The same did not happen in the Arabic and Muslim countries before Israel was created in the late 1940s. The Zionist movement was created in Russia in the late 19th century as a means to escape the purges of Tsarist Russia and inspired by the new colonialism of that era, when the Europeans effectively all went and carved out a slice of Africa. The religious significance was given to a return to Palestine, but the movement generally remained and today remains mainly secular. In Germany, as late as the 1930s, Zionism was quite unpopular. The German Jews had a central association which organised a boycott against the Nazi government, which was clearly anti-Jewish at that time, although the genocidal policies had not yet kicked in. But by contrast, the German Zionists opposed that boycott and collaborated with the Nazis in the 1933 Havara Agreement to evacuate capital and people to Palestine. And that's why some of these coins were minted in the 1930s to recognize the Nazi sponsorship of the aim of Zionists to create a colony in Palestine. In other words, the Nazis were happy to get rid of Jewish Germans from Germany, whereas the mainstream Jewish Germans regard themselves as Germans, simply of their religion was of Judaism. So that evacuation of German Jews and some of their capital suited the Nazis back at that time. The European Zionist leaders eventually extracted this British promise of a land to colonize, and Theodor Herzl was the first president of the World Zionist Organization. Chaim Weizmann later on took over from Herzl, and he moved to England, and he was born in Russia, moved to England in the early 20th century, took a very important part in negotiations leading to the British government's Balfour Declaration. This was said to be influenced by North American Zionists who had managed to get the US to enter into World War I, although the British and the French claimed the fruits of conquering the Ottoman territories because they had sacrificed much more in World War I than the Americans had. Nevertheless, as part of the deal, let's say, of getting the USA into World War I, this British Foreign Secretary wrote to Baron Lionel Rothschild, one of the Zionists, in November 1917, expressing in principle British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Palestine had been the preferred but not the only option for a Jewish homeland. In 1903, the Zionist Congress considered and rejected an offer of British colonial land in East Africa. Indeed, there were a number of options that were canvassed back at that time. Nevertheless, the Russians in particular were very keen on the use of Palestine as a site for a Jewish state. Well, with World War II, with the conversion of serious discrimination against Jews in Germany and much of Europe, when that was converted around the time of the invasion of the Soviet Union into a Holocaust of the Jewish people in Europe, it's been written by, for example, Bergen in her book about the Holocaust that at least 27 million Soviet citizens were dead, most of them Russians, also Ukrainians, as well as millions of Poles, over 1 million Yugoslavs, and scores of other people. Close to 6 million Jews were murdered, and Jewish civilization was almost eradicated from Europe. Now, it's commonly recorded that about half the killings of European Jews were in Nazi death camps, the others in ghettos and mobile executions, or as part of the slaughter in Russia. So, for example, that 5.5 to 6 million figure includes 1.3 million Russians, because about 5% of Russians were Jewish and something like 26 or 27 million Russian or Soviet citizens were slaughtered by the Nazis in that invasion of Russia, which is, of course, the land that the Nazi Germany wanted to take over in Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. Post-World War II, Europe didn't seem to offer any vindication for European Jews because for those who survived, Bergen says, the end of World War II without family or friends, many survivors, particularly Jews, had nowhere to go. Could they now simply go back as if nothing had happened? In Poland, Ukraine, Hungary and elsewhere, Jewish survivors were often met with violent hostility from the new owners. So in other words, it was Europe. It was a great European crime against the European Jews, and the responsibility of the Europeans for this crime was not really met. That is to say, the British had this idea of exporting the problem to another part of the world. Do European and American Jews have a right to self-determination in occupied Palestine? As I said before, it's not an indigenous movement claiming the return of ancestral lands. It doesn't meet the criteria for the displacement or removal of people who traditionally and continuously occupied lands, and it pays little regard to the rights of others who occupy the land they have claimed. That is to say, of course, there were a majority Arab population in Palestine when the Zionists began to build their Jewish homeland. So the Israeli claim is rather based on two rather contradictory elements, two important ones. The Zionist ideology of a return to a mythical state with some scriptural justification, whose second temple was said to be destroyed by Romans, and there's a mythology that says that then Jewish people were dispersed into other parts of Europe and so on. And secondly, as a shelter for the European Jews fleeing the Nazi Holocaust, which, as I said, was a European responsibility. Now, this was critical in getting the support of liberal Jews to the cause, because, as I said before, in Germany, most of them did not support Zionism prior to the Second World War. Palestinian people, on the other hand, do meet the indigenous criteria, especially as they don't pretend to discriminate against others on the basis of community, including communities created by religion. And there are Levant Jews, for example, and Christians who are considered Palestinians, those that have lived there for a long time. The UN General Assembly has made it very clear they strongly condemn all governments which do not recognise the right to self-determination, independence of peoples under colonial and foreign domination and alien subjugation, notably the peoples of Africa and the Palestinian people. So the creation of Israel, or as it's called by Palestinians, 1948 Palestine, contrary to popular myth, the United Nations did not create the State of Israel. What happened was there was a United Nations there was a British mandate in the late 40s, which was passed on to the newly formed United Nations. That United Nations then formed a committee which reported on the future government of Palestine. The majority report from that committee, which did not even consult the Palestinian population, and remember the UN back at this time did not include a large number of countries who were still themselves under colonial rule, that is to say, a large-scale independence movements were beginning at this time, but the process went on until much of it until the 1960s. That UN committee recommended the creation of an Arab state, a Jewish state, and special regime of international status for Jerusalem. Even though the population of Palestine in 1946, around that time, was 65% Arab and 33% Jewish, with no clear territorial separation of Jews and Arabs, the committee recommended that the area for a Jewish state be 55.5% of the total area of Palestine. You can see there was a very strong bias in favour of the European Zionists. There was substantial dissent. The resolution 181 passed in late 1947 with 33 votes in favour, 13 against and 10 abstentions. And then what happened was the Zionists themselves unilaterally proclaimed the establishment of a State of Israel. David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, unilaterally proclaimed the establishment of a State of Israel, and that declaration was immediately recognised by the governments of the US, the USSR, and many others, particularly the Europeans. Of course, that was where most of the colonial Jewish population was coming from the US, from the USSR, now Russia and Ukraine, and from Europe. But 25 Arab, Muslim, and African states have never recognised Israel, and 7 other countries subsequently revoked their earlier recognition. So preceding and accompanying the declaration was a terrible wave of violence, which Arab Palestinians call the catastrophe, al-Nakba, sweeping Palestinian people from hundreds of villages and from the land which they now call 1948 Palestine. And that was a history which has been buried to a large degree. There was a big dilemma for liberal Jews back at this time, and it's well expressed in the thought of the great scientist Albert Einstein back at that time. The question for them in the 40s was to oppose a Jewish state which would displace Palestinians, they were very well aware of this, or to support a refuge for the European Jewish victims of the Nazis. So Albert Einstein, like a lot of other liberal Jews, was convinced by the refuge argument to support an idealistic view of Israel, while he hated the fascist factions. They said they were openly that they were open fascists. For example, the faction led by Menachem Begin, which had carried out various terrorist activities and atrocities against the Arab population. Those factions later formed the Likud, which has been the dominant ruling party in recent decades. Einstein said in 1946 that a rigid demand for a Jewish state will have only undesirable results for us. I see it as impossible that the running of the entire country would be ceded to the Jews, who are but a third of the population. But a year later he had changed. He had a more optimistic view of things. He'd been persuaded by many others in Jewish community in North America and Europe. And he wrote, "Can Jewish need, no matter how acute, be met without the infringement of the vital rights of others?" Of course, he was talking about the Arab population. "My answer is in the affirmative. The influx of Jewish pioneers has resulted not in the displacement and impoverishment of the local Arab population, but in its phenomenal increase and greater prosperity." He wrote that in a letter to the Indian leader, Nehru. So he had been persuaded that there was a version of a Jewish state, which he was initially against, which could be created without prejudice to the Palestinian people. But when it came to what he called the fascist faction of the Zionists, led by Begin and others, Einstein and other prominent European Jews like Hannah Arendt wrote in 1948 that Begin and his party have the unmistakable stamp of a fascist party for whom terrorism and a leader state is the goal. It is all the more tragic that the leaders of American Zionism have refused to campaign against Begin's efforts. And they campaigned against the visit by Begin to the US back at that time. In the photo at the bottom right there, you can see the current leader Netanyahu with Begin in the background, the father of that party. Well, as Ilan Pappé, the great Israeli historian, writes about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the final plan, the fourth and final plan in March 1948 to ethnically cleanse the country as a whole, Ben-Gurion, the leader, believed that 80 to 90% of the British mandatory territory, that is to say all of Palestine, was needed, and only a state with at least 80% Jews would be a viable and stable Jewish state. So in other words, the UN Committee had recommended 55% of historic Palestine to the Zionists. They wanted 80 to 90%, and they wanted at least 80% Jews so that they could claim a stable Jewish state there. Plan C had called for the killing of Palestinian political leaders, senior officials, inciters and financial supporters, and the damaging of transport, water wells, mills, villages, clubs and cafes. But in that fourth plan, Plan D, it added by destroying villages, by setting fire to them, by blowing them up, by planting mines in their debris, and especially of those population centres. In the case of resistance, the armed force must be wiped out and the population expelled outside the borders of the state. And of course, that was the rationale for the expulsion of what became many millions of Palestinians into the surrounding countries of Lebanon, of Syria, of Jordan, for example. In the infamous Deir Yassin massacre of the 9th of April, 1948, 107 villages were killed. A series of expulsions destroyed over 500 similar villages and 11 urban neighbourhoods, with 800,000 becoming refugees in the surrounding countries. Much later, the former president of the World Jewish Congress, a colleague of Ben-Gurion, said, he quoted Ben-Gurion as saying, "Why should the Arabs make peace? If I were an Arab leader, I would never make terms with Israel. That is natural. We have taken their country. They may perhaps forget in 1 or 2 generations' time, but for the moment, there is no chance." So the Zionist leaders were counting on burying the memory of the Arab heritage in Palestine over several generations. Here's a brief video about the Deir Yassin massacre.
זיינב נלקחה בחיים עם אח שלה. היא אומרת, בעלי נתן לי $400 לפני שיצאתי מהבית, והצעתי זאת לחייל ישראלי שעמד בדרך ותפס אותנו. אמרתי לו, בבקשה, תעזוב את אחי, הוא כזה צעיר, הוא ילד. החייל לקח את הכסף, ואז הוא פשוט הפיל את אחי וירה בראשו 5 כדורים.
עדותה של זיינב הוקראה במהלך יום הזיכרון לציון 70 שנה לטבח דיר יאסין, שהפך ברבות השנים לאחד מהסמלים ההיסטוריים של הנכבה הפלסטינית.
דיר יאסין לא היה הטבח הראשון ולא הכי גדול, הוא מפורסם באופן אפילו אירוני, רק בגלל שבזמנו דוד בן גוריון וחלק מההגנה התנערו מהטבח שהיה בכפר, ואפילו דוד בן גוריון שלח מכתב התנצלות וגינוי למלך הירדני עבדאללה באותה שנה.
האירוע, כמו קודמיו, לא זכה לכבוד הראוי ויצר תסיסה בקרב תושבי שכונת גבעת שאול הסמוכה, שהתרחבה על חורבות דיר יאסין.
תל אביב ככה, גם לא זה ככה, רמלה, הכל.
As with most colonial projects, fictional racial theories were created. Conventional Zionist historians maintain that all Jews have some common genetic makeup which comes from the Levant. In fact, it's a religion, not an ethnicity. They tried to link European, or sometimes called Ashkenazi, and Mediterranean Sephardic Jews to those of the Levant. The implication is that the European Jews might be said to returning to their ancestral home. But even within the scientific community in Israel, this claim has been undermined. Shlomo Sand, an Israeli, in his book The Invention of the Jewish People, found little evidence of European Jews' ethnic links to the Levant. Eran al-Haik demonstrated that Ashkenazic DNA comes from mixtures of Jews in Iran, Greece, and northeastern Turkey, and others have concluded that at the time of the supposed destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, more than 90% of Jews were living outside Judea and mainly in southern Europe around the Mediterranean. So the ethnicity idea, or the idea of a Jewish race, which ironically is created by those who discriminate against Jews, has been recreated by the Zionists to try and create a privileged position for Jewish people who are mainly European these days, from European families. Zionism creates a type of essentialism of racial stereotypes over Arabs, which bear close resemblance to the German Nazi stereotypes of Jews. And this is common to most forms of racial ideologies linked to colonialism. For example, Julius Streicher, the Nazi ideologist who was executed for spreading hatred of the Jewish people, talked about the essence of the Jew was a peculiar one. They were moneylenders, those who were driven out of the temple by Christ. They never worked but lived on fraud. The God of Jews is the God of hatred. So that was the type of ideology from Nazi ideological leaders. Ben-Zion Netanyahu, the father of the current Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, said that the Arab has no respect for any law. In the desert he can do as he pleases. The tendency towards conflict is the essence of the Arab. He is an enemy by essence. It doesn't matter what kind of resistance, what price he will pay. His existence is one of perpetual war. Can you see those parallels there? The ethnic cleansing, it's been called a slow-motion ethnic cleansing by Yuri Avnery, another dissident Israeli historian. It's changed over time, but its ambitions remain. For example, the Yinon Plan of 1982 was a reiteration of old Zionist ambitions to create a greater Israel, Eretz Israel, a Jewish state from the brook of the Egypt, the Nile River, to the Euphrates. So there are some that say greater Israel is still reflected in the Israeli flag, which has these two blue rivers and could constitute those two rivers. The Allon Plan, which was from the Labour side, or the liberal side, let's say, of Israeli politics, set out the parameters for a 40% absorption of the occupied West Bank after the 1967 war. So the struggle between the factions, if you like, the fascist faction in Israel, the openly fascist faction, and the liberal Zionist faction was really to what extent of the occupied West Bank and at that time Gaza was going to be colonized by and taken over, annexed by the Israeli state. Labour Minister Yigal Allon in the late 60s said the last thing we must do is to return 1 inch of the West Bank, and that became de facto Israeli Labour policy for some time. But immediately and after the 67 conflict, Israel began to build illegal settlements and demolish Palestinian housing in annexed areas of the East Jerusalem, and that goes on to the current day. The UN, for its part, has not shifted from the position that these are illegal settlements, that the West Bank and East Jerusalem are under belligerent occupation and therefore protected by the Fourth Geneva Convention. And UN Security Resolution 242, famously in 1967, demanded the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from the territory occupied in the recent conflict and emphasised the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. This is a norm, by the way, of the post-colonial era, because in the colonial era, conquest of territory is one of the means by which, for example, all of the European colonies claimed to control land, either through a treaty with indigenous people, or there was an empty land that no one was there, or that it was taken over by conquest. But in the post-World War II era, the new norms, and including not least the Declaration on Decolonisation and resolutions like this 1242, are stressing that the acquisition of territory by war is no longer a matter that will be recognised by the United Nations, which of course is a type of a cooperative of states, which above all protect the territorial integrity of those states. They protect the status quo effectively. The current demographic challenge, given that the aim that David Ben-Gurion looked for in the late 40s was never met, is that the Palestinians have refused to go away. The Palestinian population has grown relative to the Jewish population, and while there are many Zionists who dismiss this demographic threat, for example, Faitelson said there's no threat because supposed declining Arab birth rates and steady emigration. Yoram Ettinger, one, also claims the figures are exaggerated, and Israel keeps trying to seek immigrant Jews, that is to say, to privilege the residence and eventually citizenship of Jewish people from any part of the world, although they seem to have more problems with the Africans than the Europeans. Nevertheless, recent estimates do show a pro-Palestinian democratic shift, and we can see this from Israeli records themselves. We don't have to look at it from a partisan history, let's say. A report from Jerusalem in 2011 showed that the Palestinian population of that city, which is meant to be under an international regime, had risen from 25.5% in 1967 to 38% in 2009. Now, the current efforts by the Netanyahu regime are trying to push out the Arab population there and keep this slow motion ethnic cleansing going on. Of course, in those Arab areas, far less is spent on the Palestinian population in terms of roads, sewerage, public parks, swimming pools, libraries, sports facilities, children's playgrounds. So there is everyday apartheid-style discrimination going on there. The Jewish Virtual Library, which is run an Israeli online site, shows that the Jews of Israel, or 1948 Palestine, have declined from a peak of 88.9% in 1960 to 74.7% in 2017. But overall, officials from Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics and the military-run administration of the occupied territories, called COGAT, say that the Arab population of Gaza, the West Bank, and the Arab citizens of Israel, who are citizens with second-class citizen rights, along with residents of the annexed East Jerusalem municipality, add up to about 6.5 million, which they recognise is about the same number as those of the Jews living between the Jordan Valley and the Mediterranean. Now, that's 2018. More recently, it's been spoken of 6.8 million for each population. So this is coming from Israeli sources. So now let's move on to the question of apartheid, because it's been written for a number of decades, but in recent years there have been some rather powerful independent reports which have confirmed the status of the Israeli colony as an apartheid state, and that has important implications under international law. The first important report was one written by Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley for the United Nations, but it was published, in fact, by one of the United Nations agencies, but then was withdrawn after a big scandal where the Israeli leaders got their sponsors, the UK and France and the US, to have it withdrawn as an official UN document. Nevertheless, the Falk and Tilley report and Richard Falk is a very senior international academic in law, wrote that the Apartheid Convention says that the crime of apartheid consists of discrete inhuman acts, but that such acts acquire the status of crimes against humanity if they intentionally serve the core purpose of racial domination. That the Israeli regime is designed for this core purpose was found to be evident in the body of laws, and other groups have pointed out there are something in the order of 60 racially discriminatory laws in the Israeli lexicon and body of laws. The oppressed persons are characterized as belonging to a specific racial group, and boundaries are created by the strategic fragmentation of the Palestinian people. It's no accident that the Gaza Strip is cut off from the West Bank, and the West Bank itself has been increasingly partitioned. The four domains of government, they say, constitute one comprehensive or let's say of segregation, constitute one comprehensive regime developed for the purpose of ensuring the enduring domination over non-Jews in all land exclusively under Israeli control in whatever category. Israel is guilty, they say, of imposing an apartheid regime on the Palestinian people, which amounts to the commission of a crime against humanity, and the international community, therefore, has a legal obligation to act within the limits of its capabilities to prevent and punish instances of apartheid that are responsibly brought to their attention. So, in other words, when this apartheid state is recognised as such by the international community, there is an obligation, a wider obligation, to dismantle that apartheid system. I mentioned there was earlier discussions of this, and in fact the UN General Assembly equated Zionism with racism in its 1975 Resolution 3379. Zionism was a form of racism and racial discrimination like the settler colonial racism of South Africa and Rhodesia, later Zimbabwe, and most of the 35 who opposed that motion were European settler colonists themselves in the Americas and Oceania and the European theatres. Authors wrote of Zionist apartheid through the 60s and 70s. Fayez Sayegh, a Palestinian scholar, identified Zionist racism as akin to South African apartheid in his 1965 book, Zionist Colonialism in Palestine. David Hurst, a British journalist, wrote of apartheid Israeli style in his book, The Gun and the Olive Branch, in the late 70s. And Edward Said, the great Palestinian intellectual, described Israeli Jewish racism and colonialism as de facto apartheid in his 1979 classic, The Question of Palestine. The UN General Assembly, in its declaration in 1975, said the racist regime in occupied Palestine and the racist regimes in Zimbabwe and South Africa have a common imperialist origin, forming a whole and having the same racist structure and being organically linked in their policy aimed at repression of the dignity and integrity of a human being. Now here's a short video clip, another one from Abby Martin, about speaking to ordinary Israelis in the street, and you can see the impact of racial ideology in the language of just ordinary people, how it had been infiltrated, or if you like, inculcated into the Israeli mentality.
I think Israelis have to take over, and they have to kick them away. It will be much better. Not to kill them, just to go back to Arab countries.
But it's really rightfully ours if you look at the history and at like the wars, and we didn't even start a lot of the wars, and we conquered these places rightfully, like it's ours.
1,400 years later, we come back. Now, I'm not saying that we can blame the people living here for what happened, but you gotta accept that that's some kind of divine justice, that their great-great-great-great-grandfathers kicked my great-great-great-grandfather out of here, and then we come back, and all of a sudden they're like, well, no, we don't want it, it's not fair.
I think that the Jews came here, they took this land, and this is our land now, and I don't think there should be here no Arabs. Like Arabs, they want, we gave them Gaza, they should go live there quietly if they want, they should go back to Iraq, I don't know, to wherever they want.
I think that we need to... איך אומרים לאיש את הערבית? כן, תגידי לי את המילה הזאת.
I don't think there's any answer to it.
Really?
There's only one way, like, I would carpet bomb them.
You would carpet bomb them?
It's the only way you could deal with it. Like, or try to stop them a different way. It never worked.
I think that we're miserable. The Arabs, make פיגועים and we need to kill Arabs. No.
I think another thing that the Jews should have rights to hate them. I think we have the right to hate them. I don't see a reason why not. I wouldn't trust any of them.
אין מצב שיהיה פה שלום בארץ, אי אפשר לעשות איתם שלום, הם תמיד שונאים אותנו. אם אי אפשר לעשות שלום והמצב ככה לא יכול להישאר, אז צריך לטפל בהם בדרכים אחרות, אין מה לעשות.
I think we should give them a country. If you're doing any problem, you just go in there to give them a country, and then it's going to be a war between countries, you know? If they're going to throw rockets, we're going to throw one big one and done.
That sort of racism is generally created by colonial regimes because they see it as necessary to reinforce the legitimacy or the political will of their project, and to try and justify the designation of another group of people as second-class citizens there. It's much more than simple prejudice. So here is another report, this time from an Israeli organization, B'Tselem, on apartheid in 2021, reinforcing the report by Falk and Tilley. That report said that a regime that uses laws, practices, and organized violence to cement the supremacy of one group over another is an apartheid regime. Israeli apartheid, which promotes the supremacy of Jews over Palestinians, was not born in one day or of a single speech. It is a process that's gradually grown more institutionalized and explicit, with mechanisms introduced over time in law and practice to promote Jewish supremacy. Jewish supremacy has now been enshrined in basic law, making it a binding constitutional principle, unlike ordinary law practices by authorities which can be challenged. This signals to all state institutions that they not only can but must promote Jewish supremacy in the entire area under Israeli control. And below you have some images of the walls and fences in occupied Palestine and how Palestinian people are herded into cages to be monitored in which areas they are, which areas they're allowed to be. It's a very complicated system which often the officials of the regime don't fully understand themselves. Finally, there was a report by the US organization Human Rights Watch, similarly, calling Israel responsible for the crime of apartheid. Now, this is significant because Human Rights Watch was set up in the late 70s as a agency of the liberal side of US foreign policy, usually associated with the Democrats, precisely to accuse the foreign policy enemies of the US of human rights abuses. It began as Helsinki Watch, aimed at the old Soviet Union, and since then has been really reinforcing US foreign policy and aimed at the enemies of US foreign policy in Latin America, other parts of the world, accusing them, trying to delegitimize them with human rights arguments. So in most respects, Human Rights Watch has been effectively very close to the US State Department, particularly the Democrat-controlled US State Departments. But in this case, the report was that a threshold had been crossed. What they meant was that in the past, groups had warned about Israel heading towards apartheid, and now they are agreeing with the other reports by saying that Israeli authorities have deprived millions of people of their basic rights by virtue of their identity as Palestinians in the occupied territory, the Palestinian occupied territories. Movement restrictions, land appropriation, expropriation, forcible transfer, denial of residency and nationality, the mass suspension of civil rights constitute, quote, inhumane acts set out under the Apartheid Convention and the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court Statute. Acts made amidst systematic oppression and with the intent to maintain domination make up the crime against humanity of apartheid. Collectively, they say, these policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territories severely deprive Palestinians of fundamental human rights, including to residency, private property, and access to land, services, and resources on a widespread and systematic basis. When committed with discriminatory intent on the basis of victims' identity as part of a group or collectivity, the fiction that's been called a race, they amount to the crime against humanity of persecution under the Rome Statute and customary international law. The Israeli government also violates the right of Palestinians inside Israel on account of their identity. They're talking about the so-called Israeli Arabs who have citizenship but a second-class citizenship. Now, this report led to a number of reactions. First of all, the long-term president of Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth, referring to an article by Mohammed Shahada, said that the new Human Rights Watch report on the Israeli government's crime of apartheid should be read not as an effort to delegitimize Israel, but as a wake-up call, and perhaps most pressing for those most invested in Israel's future. So there's an attempt to spin this that apartheid is something that really is something that deserves some encouragement or a wake-up call rather than a dismantling of a pernicious system. On the other hand, independent Jewish voices in Canada have endorsed the report, saying that it makes even clearer what Palestinians have known for decades, that Israel constitutes an apartheid state. The real question is, what should we do about it? But Salem, which had already issued its report some months earlier, said that the international community has by and large refused to wake up to the reality of Israel's apartheid regime. Instead, it preferred to keep pretending the apartheid threshold might be crossed at some unspecified time, i.e. in the future, and always pushed into the future. Thus, a threshold cross, the report by Human Rights Watch must now serve as an urgent wake-up call for the international community to finally take concrete action in rejection of apartheid and in support of human rights, democracy and justice. Well, the question is rescue or dismantle. Is it possible that an Israeli state with 60 discriminatory laws and with a foundational law talking about a Jewish state can be rescued from that state, or does it have to be reconstructed substantially? Let's move to Palestinian resistance, because this is at the core of the potential democratic future of Palestine. Now, the key elements there are that it's only Palestinian resistance that slowed down this ethnic cleansing. It may have been possible in some dream in the past that Palestinian people would simply accept their third-class status, or would leave, would be driven out into Lebanon, into Syria, into Jordan, for example. They would go to other countries and not come back. But the resistance has remained, and it's been passive, active, and underestimated. There is the simple fact of Palestinians remaining on their land, which, as I said, has resulted in the fact that the populations of Palestinian Arabs and Jewish Israelis is now about the same. This is often referred to in Arabic as sumud, steadfastness or resilient resistance. It's been said that too little attention has been paid to that autonomous resistance, including adaptation by women and whole families in the face of this extreme violence, simply asserting Palestinian culture and identity. Second, there's been active resistance, including armed resistance. Now, this is legitimate, despite the propaganda wars where it's demanded that all resistance is rejected and the Palestinians may be viewed only as victims, sympathetically viewed as victims, not when they retaliate or strike back. But resistance is legitimate in international law in the context of violent colonisation, and it's well recognised in international law. Vicious, at times genocidal incitements are made by Zionist leaders supporting repeated attacks on Palestinian communities. And those attacks are in large part to make those territories uninhabitable and drive the people from what are called the promised lands for the Zionist population. In that context, both remaining and fighting back represent resistance. The apartheid state controls more Arab land than ever these days, but the uprisings show that new settlements, their military bases and their feeder roads are not safe. These settlements or colonies are dotted throughout the West Bank, but almost every day there are snipings and incidents occurring against those settlements. This is the outcome of an apartheid system. Who are the Palestinians? There have been a lot of surveys done on Palestinians, more than most other communities. Who is resisting? In a 2018 survey of those in the occupied Palestinian territories, 61% said they identified as Palestinian and only 12% as Muslim. So it is a national struggle of sorts and not a religious struggle primarily. Because there are Christian, Druze and Bedouin Palestinians, although minorities, and as the colonial powers have always played on religious or ethnic divisions, the preferred identity has always remained Palestinian. And even though most Palestinians are quite religious, more than those in other Arab countries, for example, say that they pray 5 times a day, but only a tiny minority, 2.2% in that survey, saw that extreme Islamists such as ISIS, Daesh or al-Nusra help their cause. The Syrian scholar Ghada Hashim Talhami said that the Palestinian nationalism is a special case of Arab nationalism, and that helps explain the expectation that the neighbouring Arab countries, nationalists in Arab countries of Egypt, Lebanon, Syria and Iraq, even the Gulf monarchies, might assist the Palestinian resistance. The problem is that there have been serious leadership failures, and the population, for its part, supports its institutions, but it doesn't have much faith in the major parties. And that comes partly from the divisions between the Islamist and the secular parties. So, for example, while almost all Palestinian people reject a Palestinian state that does not contain Jerusalem as its capital, more than half don't trust any political personality. Only 46% regard the Palestinian National Authority's performance as good, but 66% see the need to maintain it. In July 2016, Fatah had the highest of support amongst the parties at 33%, followed by Hamas at 14%, and the Popular Front, the Socialist Popular Front, on 3.4%. More than a third said they didn't support any faction. So there's a large majority of Palestinians who support their nation and their institutions, but there has been a crisis of leadership in recent times. Internationally, and this is important because it supplements the ongoing resistance, there has been increasing international recognition of Palestine. First of all, in 1974, the UN General Assembly recognised the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, as the representative of the Palestinian people and invited it to plenary UN sessions. The General Assembly also acknowledged the proclamation of the State of Palestine in 1988 and began to use Palestine in place of the PLO for the delegation. In 2011, Palestine was admitted to UNESCO, and soon after, the US stopped its membership payments to that UN body. In 2012, the UN General Assembly accorded non-member observer state status to Palestine, and that marked the first time that the General Assembly considered Palestine to be a state. That was important because it meant that Palestine therefore had a greater status in UN agencies like UNESCO and the International Criminal Court. So Israel and the US withdrew as members of UNESCO for a while, citing anti-Israel bias, and there were similar tensions at the UN's Human Rights Council. In 2018, 137 UN member states recognised the State of Palestine, and as I said, the implications of this are that the Palestinian Authority has referred the atrocities against the Palestinian population to the International Criminal Court. For example, the slaughters of civilians in Gaza as crimes against humanity. So the ICC has recently decided to investigate these, much to the chagrin of the Zionist leaders. It's important to recognise too that there are very key allies to the Palestinian struggle in the region, the so-called frontline states, or the regional axis of resistance allies. The mainly Shia Muslim Islamic Republic of Iran has played the major role in supporting mainly Sunni Muslim Palestinians. This is clearly not sectarian support. Iran has paid money to Palestinian families of fallen resistance fighters after they had their houses demolished in the collective punishment that Israel carries out. It's also supported with training and weapons virtually all the Palestinian militia which resist the Palestinian state, even those linked with the anti-Shia Muslim Brotherhood. And much the same can be said about Hezbollah, Lebanese resistance in Lebanon and in Syria. Factions of the leadership of those Palestinian groups exist in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Iran. A very large Palestinian diaspora is housed in Syria, along with all the Palestinian factions, some of whom joined the Syrian Arab Army as Palestinian brigades. So those states, the so-called resistance axis, remain strategic Palestinian allies. And particularly after the murder of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, all of the Palestinian factions came out and openly acknowledged what Israel had been saying for a while, that it was Iran was the main source of the weapons that the Palestinian resistance has with which to defend itself from the constant attacks. Well, publicly, there has been, of course, massive smokescreens about what the resistance means. And I give an example here about one of the attacks on Gaza in 2014, the Israeli assault in 2014, where these figures are very out of date. They were contemporary reports at the time. What I've done in the graphic at the right is to talk about the numbers of civilian deaths the number of deaths overall, the number of civilian deaths, in other words, the proportion of so-called collateral damage in that violence. First of all, to point out that it is not simply a conflict, that is to say, of two sides or two relatively equal sides fighting, because the scale of the killing of Palestinians is always far greater than the killing of Israelis. In that case, although the European Union was condemning what they called the indiscriminate firing of rockets into Israel from Gaza, and the then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said Hamas rockets have randomly struck Israel. Much the same thing was said by a number of international leaders in the most recent Israeli attack on Gaza in May 2021. The New York Times back in 2014 said Hamas is committing a war crime by firing rockets indiscriminately. Yet let's look a little closer at this. Based on independent sources or even sources from the other side, the UN confirmed that 3/4 of the Palestinians killed at that time were civilians. And the Israeli sources confirmed that only 3 civilians at that time were amongst the 51 killed in Israel. 48 were Israeli Defense Forces. So when we look at the data, break it down, look a little more carefully at the sources, we can see that the Palestinian actions in that particular operation, and as I said, this is a little bit out of date, it turned out that more than 2,000 Palestinians were killed. But at that time, the Palestinian actions, the resistance, retaliation, was far more discriminate than the Israeli actions. That is to say, more than 75% of Palestinian deaths were of civilians, and only 6% of the 51 Israeli civilian deaths were civilians. So care is needed when reading reports about the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let's move on to an analysis of the future of Palestine. What are the prospects for an inclusive and democratic Palestine? I've given an overview to start here, the challenge in terms of challenges and strengths. The challenges, you might say, are that the Zionist military occupation, the domination of the Palestinian territories is almost complete. That is to say, the Israelis control all of the boundaries of occupied Palestine. They have enormous power. They have delegated some local government-like responsibilities to the Palestinian Authority, which has really become a very tame leader in terms of in political terms, and the lack of trust of the Palestinian Authority is borne out in opinion polls there. The Israeli state also has strong Western allies with military and media assets. It has a fanatic Zionist mission and racial ideology that you saw in some of the Vox Pop interviews there before, and there's significant disunity amongst the Palestinian factions, and including with their regional allies to some degree. Nevertheless, on the strength side of the ledger, we see this ongoing Palestinian resistance where people have remained on their land. They maintain a resistance, so they cannot be completely subdued or wiped out or intimidated into doing nothing. There is a low-level resistance virtually every day in Palestine, although what comes to attention in the international media is only the huge massacres that are carried out. There is a strong moral and international legitimacy which is being reinforced over time, as I pointed out with that chart there, in terms of the recognition of Palestine at the international or UN level. There is the existence and the maintenance of strong and united regional allies, despite the fact that the so-called normalization process initiated by President Trump in the US brought out of the closet, so to speak, some of those who were privately collaborating with Israel, or some Arab states that were privately collaborating with Israel over time, like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, for example, and in another context, Saudis. There is the vulnerability of Israel's allies and its Jewish supporters internationally to the exposure of apartheid crimes. That is to say, that the illegitimacy of Israeli operations and its apartheid policies have consequences for the morale of its supporters around the world. Let's look at the weakness here now. First of all, the factionalism I mentioned, the fiction of two states. This is a problem really for the Palestinian struggle, because so long as the illusion of two states is held up, there is a distraction from the reality of apartheid. So a serious obstacle is disunity, and Islamic sectarianism in particular has been a key divisive force, especially since the Palestinian struggle is overwhelmingly seen by Palestinians as a national struggle. The Palestinian Authority has little moral authority amongst the Palestinian communities and often acts to bolster the two-state myth, which masks the reality of apartheid. And the largest potential Arab ally in the region, Egypt, has really effectively been bought off and sidelined in recent decades since the 1970s. So the resistance has therefore relied on Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah. But exposure of this two-state myth demoralizes liberal Zionists, who are one important faction within Israel, but also an even more important faction outside Israel, particularly in the United States, which is the other big population of Jewish people of European background. So here's a few of the internal liberal Zionists who have an image of a tolerant and a kind people. They see themselves as being a just people and anti-racist, and so they're easily offended by association with Zionist fascism and apartheid. So for that reason, expanding colonization of the West Bank has demoralized many of them. Here is a liberal Zionist, Ari Shavet, who has written extensively from that point of view. He wrote back in 2016 that the one-state solution was developing into a cancer that will soon be irreversible. In other words, he was still holding on to the idea of two states, and including in his book, My Promised Land. If the settlers continue to rise by 2025, he wrote, quote, the Zionist project will be over, we will have passed the point of no return. He repeated this in 2021 when the question of the settlements was discussed again and conflict around the colonization of the West Bank, and he wrote, if Israeliness and Jewishness are not vital components in our identity, and if we have a foreign passport, and quite a lot of Israelis do, many of them are perhaps a minority, perhaps 20 or 25% European or North American passports, that's it, we must say goodbye, pack our bags and move to San Francisco or Berlin. Well, that's one reaction to what he calls a demoralization of the ongoing settlements of the West Bank and the spectre, if you like, of a one-state, a real one-state situation. Similarly, two former Israeli prime ministers have said that the collapse of this two-state idea, really a myth, will mean apartheid and an inevitable end to the Jewish state. And that was said by former Prime Minister Ehud Barak and former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, that there will be an apartheid-like struggle if the two-state idea fails. Remember, this is a two-state idea that's been around for 73 years now. It's nothing new. Ehud Barak also warned that Israel faces a slippery slope towards apartheid. They know they cannot win in an anti-apartheid struggle, so they will pretend that there is still the possibility of an Arab state there. And I suppose that is at the root of the Trump administration in its final year of trying to resurrect an idea which looked like the Bantustans of South Africa, of tiny little pockets of Arab territory on the West Bank that could be still called an Arab state. Now, an exception to this rule, or someone really who has moved a little bit beyond those contradictions, but in the same category, is journalist Gideon Levy, who was a first-generation Israeli patriot. His parents emigrated to Palestine in the post-war period. He calls himself an Israeli patriot who once backed the two-state solution, but now he sees it as a trick, and he has converted to the one democratic state idea. Let's have a look at and see how Gideon Levy expresses this.
Israel never had an intention to go for a two-state solution, not even for a single moment. It is really almost historical irony to see now official representatives of Israel coming and defending the two-state solution. What did stop you for 50 years to go for it? Why did you go for it? What are you waiting for? Why didn't you go for it? And if this is not enough, anyone who builds one terrace in the occupied territories has no intention to go for the two-state solution, period. And there was not one single Israeli government who stopped for one day building those criminal settlements. because nobody is going to evacuate 700,000 settlers. And without evacuation of 700,000 settlers, there is no two-state solution. And there is no Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is a brutal Israeli occupation which must come to its end one way or the other. Two peoples share one piece of land there. One people has all the rights in the world. The other people has no rights whatsoever. It looks like apartheid. It talks like apartheid. It is apartheid. So now we have to discuss what is the alternative. And the alternative is a new discourse of equal rights. And then I want to hear from Israel, what is the answer of Israel? Why not equal rights?
That logic outlined by Gideon Levy is, of course, something that has possessed many Palestinian people, and as a result, the idea of one democratic state in Palestine has become much more prominent. A single democratic state seems the best of four options because the first is the status quo. If nothing changes, ongoing conflict, not only in Palestine, but in spilling over into the entire region. Of course, it's not without significance that the conflict Israel generates is also with Lebanon, with Syria, even to some extent with Jordan, although there's not much of a resistance, there's more collaboration with the monarchy in Jordan. So to maintain the increasingly obvious apartheid system does not seem to be a real option. Secondly, amongst some enthusiasts, particularly outside Palestine, the idea of expelling all the settlers, which is attractive in a sense when you see Palestinians being deprived of their land and their houses in Jerusalem and in the West Bank, and people from New York or Ukraine, for example, coming and taking over their properties. But nevertheless, given that there is now something like 6.8 million Jewish Israelis alongside 6.8 million Palestinian Arabs, it's an unlikely prospect. And also that there's several generations of this. We have up to 3 generations of Israelis which are considered still settlers by Palestinians. So the idea of expelling that entire class of people seems unlikely and a potential bloodbath, and no one, I think, really wants to take that way forward. The idea of 2 states, the steady land theft has really destroyed that and made it a Bantustan option, like the idea of the homelands in South Africa in the 80s, which was put up in the final dying days of apartheid South Africa, where instead of a democratic state in South Africa, you could have some little dotted bits of native lands where the majority of the population would cram themselves in. Now, that's really what the proposal from the Trump administration looked like in 2020, basically, that they were talking about the idea of a Palestinian state in these tiny little pockets dotted throughout the West Bank, which didn't have any real economic or political weight, but only were effectively local government administrations dominated by the Israeli administration. So that idea of 2 states, as unlikely and pathetic as it seems, is there for a reason, to cover up the idea that there is really one state. And the question is, the consequence of opposing apartheid Israel as an apartheid state is that the notion of one democratic state becomes far more the idea of a real future for Palestine. It's a logical response to apartheid, as in South Africa. It has that parallel. And there are at least 4 one-state campaign groups at the moment. I've given you their names and their internet addresses here at the moment. Books have been written about it. Virginia Tilley, who wrote that report with Richard Falk, has talked about the idea of a one-state solution. And now you have the consequence of so-called loyal Israelis like Gideon Levy from the Israeli side saying that his sense of justice has been offended so badly that the only thing he can see is giving equal rights to Palestinians in the occupied territories. Resistance has remained the key. Popular resistance has not gone away over the 7 decades of repression, encirclement, ethnic cleansing, and that's been the principal asset. If the Palestinian people had not resisted, well, perhaps the area would have been taken over. The colony would have extended to the extent where we had a small minority of Palestinian dissidents, but we don't. We have a very large population of which is inclined to resist and to maintain their identity. So resistance remains the foundation of Palestine's growing moral and international legitimacy, stronger diplomatic relations, and an increased rejection of Israel around the world and greater UN recognition of Palestine as a nation. But a key complicating factor, and something which I'll come to in the next week's topic, is that Israel is not simply a Zionist colony. It remains a station, if you like, a base for its sponsors in the region, particularly the US. It was created by the British, really, but the US took it over pretty much in the 1950s, and Israel is really a base by which to control the wider region. As the current US President, Joe Biden, says, if Israel did not exist, we would have to create it. And we have to understand that in terms of the US project to create what they call a new Middle East, to dominate the entire region and have a core base, a military base, and a colony by which to coordinate its operations in the region. So that is a bigger complicating factor to the resolution of the problem of apartheid Israel. The means of further delegitimizing Israel have been often expressed through this concept of BDS, boycott, divestment and sanctions, a campaign that models itself on the sanctions, the legitimate sanctions imposed on apartheid South Africa in the 1980s, not on the unilateral measures imposed increasingly by Washington against dozens of independent countries. And even those who don't support the BDS movement or BDS campaigns, they shrink from Israel at times. For example, the Israeli-born actress Natalie Portman, who is Israeli-born, lives in the US, but she turned down a $2 million prize, the Genesis Prize in Israel, because she was too ashamed to be seen with the Prime Minister Netanyahu. And there is a problem of demoralization amongst a large group of Israelis in the US and in Europe, but particularly in the US, who may have dual citizenship and have some sentimental connection to Israel, but they despise the openly fascist faction which has been controlling Israel in recent times. So there's the spread effects of BDS, that in effect there are de facto spread effects when the legitimacy of Israel goes down, as it has recently with its most recent attack and massacre and destruction of large civilian buildings, including high-rise buildings in Gaza. Richard Falk, the former UN Special Rapporteur, rejected the idea of Palestine as a lost cause, precisely because it was winning in the legitimacy battle. Palestine is winning what in the end is the most important war, the struggle for legitimacy, which is most likely to determine the political outcome. And he cited Vietnam, Algeria, and Iraq. The side with a greater perseverance, by that he means resistance, in Arabic terms, and resilience, Sumud, not the side that controlled the battlefield, won in the end in those cases in Vietnam, Algeria, and Iraq. So to sum up key points, Palestine is a land, a people, and a culture with a unique and diverse history. There have been attempts to capture it by different religious crusades, but they've never succeeded. The latest attempt to seize control of the Jerusalem-centered region has been by European Zionists, backed by British, French, and US sponsors. The rationales for the Israeli colony have been to some extent contradictory. One, the Zionist idea of a mythical return of a supposedly dispersed people, and two, as a refuge from the massacres of Nazi Germany. But the 70-plus years of Palestinian resistance has prevented the emergence of a legitimate Jewish state. Instead, there's now a very well-recognized apartheid regime. The failure of the two-state idea and wider recognition of Israeli apartheid suggests a likely forced transition to a single democratic state, a transition which has parallels in apartheid South Africa in the 80s, but is complicated by the US and NATO using Israel as a base by which to try and control the wider region, also a failing project which I'll talk about in the next session. The weaknesses on the Palestinian side are disunity, leadership failures, persistence of the two-state myth to some extent reinforced by the torpor of the Palestinian Authority. Nevertheless, the transition is likely to be finally determined by a combination of Palestinian resistance and failing Israeli legitimacy and demoralization. Palestine is hardly a lost cause. There have been gains in recent years. The resistance imposed limits to the north and the south, with the withdrawal of the colonists from Gaza and from southern Lebanon, the key strength remains the steadfastness of a battered but brave people. Once again, here's some further reading. Ilan Pappé's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, is a very important historical document. A bigger picture from the late Albert Hourani, A History of the Arab Peoples, is important reading. There is a good book by Mazin Kumsieh, Popular Resistance in Palestine, and the book by the Israeli historian, The Invention of the Jewish People, which undermines the Zionist mythology, is important to read too.